Welcome to the Generation to Revelation podcast. A boomer,
a Gen X,
and a millennial walk into a church to discuss relevant topics for being a Christian today.
Well, welcome back. This is the podcast from First Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Travis Norton, senior pastor here. Been here about 7 years.
I'm Lori Duncan, Minister of Spiritual Care. Been here about 5 minutes.
I'm Pastor Michaela Eskew. I've been here about 5 years, and I'm an associate pastor of Christian Formation.
All right, so we're going to tackle the topic of faith and politics,
Oh boy.
Which is so exciting that we have all this political stuff that's in the church and trying to figure out as a church, what do we do with that? What role does politics play in the church, or should it not play any role? And what role should the church play in politics and the political game? Maybe we should start by asking the question, what do we mean by politics? 'Cause that's a big question. What do you guys think when you hear the word politics? What comes to mind?
Politicians.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. arguing.
Right, definitely all the arguing and the bickering over who's going to win, who's going to be in power. I think Republicans and Democrats and all the fighting about who's going to rule us, I guess, who's going to have power. And then how that comes into the church is division. It's so often, right, that there's pitting the Republicans in the church against the Democrats in the church, and then you try to stay away from it all because you don't want that division to be in your church.
Right, and you have echo chambers. You have some churches that are very Democratic, and you have churches that are very Republican, and then you have something called the Purple Church, which is the reds of the Republicans and the blues of the Democrats mixing together, and maybe or maybe not they know who is who's across the aisle from them politically and literally on a Sunday. But purple churches, which First Lutheran is one of those purple churches.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've always been a part of purple churches where you didn't want to really out yourself as to what side you were voting for on any, especially during like presidential election seasons, because you didn't want to alienate half the congregation, and you weren't. I've never been sure who's Republican and who's Democrat, and so I've always been pretty careful about that. But I've been doing this now for 21 years, so you get a good sense of where people are and how they vote, and they confide in you. But that, for me, that's kind of cool, because then I know that the ultra liberal and the ultra conservative are sitting in the pew right next to each other. They probably don't know this about each other, but they're worshiping one God, and that becomes a pretty beautiful thing that then you want to protect, right? That you want to keep safe.
And they pass the peace to each other.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and they sit at the communion table together.
It might be better if they actually knew that about each other, right? If that guy knew that I'm passing the peace with my political opponent or someone who supports my political opponent. So I thought the most timely thing about this is that recently the IRS has issued a statement that it is now legal for pastors to endorse a political candidate from the pulpit. Should we do this?
I don't think so. I think to your point, you were just saying, right, that we don't want to ostracize another group in our congregation. And as someone who has been part of one party for most of my voting life, I've never always been 100% on that candidate. And so there's some things that I don't like about their policies, or there's something that I didn't like about their debate. And so that would take full 100%. I am all in on this candidate, and I don't think I've ever felt that. And so because I don't have that kind of conviction, the only conviction I have is to Jesus. I don't think that that's something that I would want to bring to the pulpit, because that's a piece of my life, but it's not something that I would want to out myself on, I guess.
So even though it's legal now, you don't think you're going to be doing this in the next election cycle?
I do not.
No.
I do not.
Yeah, I don't think I will either. I think it's partly because the pulpit is such a sacred space to me, and it's people expect to hear from, this isn't correct completely, but they expect to hear from God there. And so you're speaking on behalf of God. That's, even in our traditional service, when we're wearing the robe and the stoles, all of those things are to kind of put on Christ and to represent Christ and speak for Christ. And so that's too presumptuous of me to think that I know the candidate Jesus wants for president or not. And the other part of it is neither of the political parties fully represent my Christian values or what I
Exactly,
understand,
exactly.
the Bible teaches. Like I can find serious flaws in both platforms about that's not Christian, that's against the Bible, and so I feel like whenever you're voting, you're never voting for your purity, I guess, that someone who's purely
Exactly.
because you're never voting for Jesus. It's not like Jesus is running for office.
Nor would Jesus ever run for
Right.
office.
Some
His
sinner,
disciples would have loved that, but he decided not to.
right? Some sinner is running for office, and we have to vote for one of them. And it's going to be a sinner, and it's going to be a fallen person who's part of a party that's not 100% Christian.
But I don't think that the government is without being like following Christian values, though. I think that the government, like we are called as Christians to vote and to work towards policies that fall in line with our Christian values of wanting equality and people to be represented equally in society. And so I don't want to completely separate my civic life from my faith life.
I think that's where it gets tricky, because how do you then do that, or what? Because I agree. I think we're not supposed to, like, because we're Christians, we check out of society, and we're not trying to influence society toward a certain way. So how do we do that? Lori, we were talking earlier about experiences you've had in church where, I don't know if they endorsed candidates or made it pretty clear who you should vote for. What was that like?
Coming from a conservative past, church conservative flavor, if you will, the rule of thumb was always that it was illegal to endorse candidates at that time and keep the 501c3. But it was very clear which platform the pastor was against and which platform the pastor was for, so that a candidate didn't have to be named, because it was made very clear which way was the perceived more Jesus-y way to vote. I'll just put it that way. If Jesus were here, he would never vote for that. He would vote for this. And so that was, excuse me, I did kick you in. Sorry. Yes, so it was pretty clear. It was pretty clear without being named. I'm not a fan of that, actually.
Yeah.
Of naming.
Of endorsing. You're not going to be endorsing anybody from the pulpit.
Well, I'm never in the pulpit, so that's no danger.
We've put you in the pulpit before.
Yeah.
It could happen again.
Could happen again.
Well, how would you feel as someone in the pew if the pastor, even if it was someone, what if it was the person you wanted to win, and you heard that from the pulpit saying, and you were in agreement? How would that?
Well, I view things so differently than I used to that it would be very difficult now, even if it was the person that I was for, because I just pulled back from thinking that Christianity and Americanism, the United States, were the same thing. I kind of used to be in that vein, and I'm not there anymore. The church has been around 2,000 years. It transcends the United States. Again, not that we divorce ourselves from politics, but it's, to me, for me personally, it's not a place for someone standing in the place of God to talk about a candidate in the United States government.
So what are we trying to do then as a church? We talk about, we pray the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Does that mean we're trying to create a Christian nation? Trying to, create laws that are Christian and get candidates that are Christian? Is that part of what it means to try to influence society? Is that what the church is trying to accomplish?
Well, I would have to say that Christian would have to be defined.
Because exactly what I was going to say.
Because there are people who claim to be Christians in both parties that say the person in the other party is not.
Absolutely.
So that it becomes a messy subject.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a hard time answering my own question, because I think that we're trying to influence the world toward Christ and toward Christian values. And we have values. We have what we think justice is, what we think peace looks like, what we think Jesus taught, what the commandments kind of lay out as far as what's right and wrong. And if we're in this society for the good of our neighbor, then you would think we would want to move laws toward those values. And so where's the line between kind of acting in the world as Christians, voting certain ways, because I vote from my faith. I vote, what I think Jesus cares about. I try to vote for candidates who I think are going to do things that are in line with what Jesus taught. Where's the line? When we talk about separation of church and state, like, where is that line?
Well, that I don't know if I have an answer to, but I've heard it 3 times already in the conversation. Values, Christian values, values, values. And so we're going to have to address, I think,
what are our Christian values?
What are our Christian values? Yeah, because I know that where I came from, they would be defined differently than how I define my own values now. So, but that was a Christian place, and I'm still in a different Christian place. So,
right. Because Christian values can be brought up in abortion conversations, and that has become a very hot topic in politics on what line you draw there and what your Christian faith should be calling you to and something like that. And Christian values is something that's thrown out. Good Christian values would support abortion. Good Christian values would not support abortion. And so I think that there's a lot of them out there that could do exactly that. Immigration policies and what you do with income disparity and the government programs that you would have or shouldn't have for people that are struggling in poverty. And so there's Christian values is pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but Christian values is also giving money to the poor. So
right. If you go down the list and you say, okay, here are the issues in the world. Like, what does Jesus think about immigration? Mm-hmm. What does Jesus think about abortion? What does Jesus think about gay marriage? Mm-hmm. What does Jesus think about the death penalty? What does Jesus think about adoption? What is, you just kind of go through all the controversial things in our world, and you get a bunch of Christians in the room and you ask that question, and you're not going to get one answer. It's not like everybody says, oh, well, Jesus would say this. And everybody knows that and everybody agrees with that. Right. Like they're controversial for a reason, in that even good Christians who love Jesus, read their Bible, are smart about their faith, are going to come to different conclusions about how Jesus would want you to vote on each one of those. And
I think that's why I'm personally against endorsing a candidate from the pulpit, because decent people with decent hearts who are following Jesus are going to land in different places. So I don't see how it could be anything but divisive, which is not what we're called to do.
And so then, should the church just say, that's not our thing? We're not going to talk about these topics. We're not going to push in any direction for these topics. We're just going to stay out of it altogether. Is that the right answer?
I don't think we can. I don't think we can, because there's great atrocities that can happen when there's not some ethic that's being brought in. And I know that there's what people are trying to call secular ethics now, where they're trying to, completely separate it from any kind of religious tradition. But ultimately, we know that we have an ethic that does come from our faith. And so there are going to be things that we see on our ballot on any given election where we know that doesn't sit well with us if it passed or if it didn't pass. And so I think that we can't just separate it. We can't. And their church actually does need to possibly have different speakers come in and talk based on particular things that are coming forward. Like if there's a big housing project that's about to happen for lower income, housing, you're going to have people on either side. And so you should be able to have a debate at church, or possibly have a town hall that allows for Christians to have these conversations. Because I think one of the biggest issues that we've gotten into this place is that you weren't supposed to talk about religion, at the dinner table. And so now we can't
politics, right?
Right. We can't have good conversations anymore without assuming that being on the defensive or being ready to attack the other. Right. And so I think the church can actually be a good place to have those hard discussions, but we have to walk into them with a certain understanding that we're going to listen as often as we speak. And I think that's the hardest part. But I do think the church is a place where these open discussions for different things can happen.
I'd like to see that more. I think probably in our church, we have stepped away from talking about it all because it feels so dangerous. Yeah. It feels like if you bring up these subjects, try to talk politics, even if it's just a subject and not a politician,
right?
Like you're talking about the subject of immigration, because that's a big one right now, that even bringing it up, people get antsy and they pick sides, and it doesn't feel like we can talk about it and still maintain our unity at the end of the day. And I think that's because we've ignored it so long, we've kind of lost that muscle of how to have kind of vibrant conversations where, maybe in the end it's 80% thinks that this is the Christian way and 20% thinks it's not. And so at that point, do you say, we're going to speak as a church, we're going to say as a congregation, even though we're not in full agreement, we've got a majority that believe this, and this is the thing we're going to advocate for in the public square. We haven't done that because I think I'm really shy about it because I love my people. I love my people that I disagree with, and I don't want to pit them against each other. And so I've had a hard time figuring out how to talk about things or introduce conversations. And it's really, like, I confess that I'm just fearful of how people will take it, that they won't be able to take it. That's maybe putting too little faith in my people. But.
Well, maybe this is not quite the direction we're thinking about going, but to me the question partly there would be, is Sunday morning a place for that? Sunday morning from the pulpit a place for that? Or do we set a different time during the week? We are going to open up to having political discourse. And these are the ground rules. As a church, we're going to do that. So that to me would be the question. Should we be talking about it Sunday mornings and or other times?
Right. And I think Sunday mornings, like, it's the pastor's in charge, right? The pastor has the pulpit. Is the only one who's really speaking off the cuff or sharing their own thoughts on a matter. And it's not a conversation. And I think that's why I would keep it out of the pulpit, or, not completely though, because there are some issues. If there are soldiers on the streets killing people in the name of the government, and I get up in the pulpit and I don't say that's wrong, then I'm shirking my duty as a proclaimer of the gospel and, naming sin and calling us to be better. And so, but it's a sacred duty, and it's really, I think you do it with a lot of fear and trepidation of, like, if you're going to mention something that's associated with a political party in the pulpit, you better have done your homework. You better do it very carefully and humbly. I think a much safer place is like a public forum where it's a conversation and it's not the pastor just getting the pulpit and getting to say what they think. Right. And then nobody gets to push back except when they're shaking hands on the way out the door and saying, I don't like that. Right. But I've had people like COVID, for example, like we shut down the church and didn't have meetings in person. We went to online. So the church, I guess I shouldn't say shut down the church. The church stayed open and kept proclaiming the gospel, just not in person in the sanctuary. And we advocated wearing masks, right? And those, at the time, I didn't think I was making a political statement or choosing a political party, but it got politicized really quickly. And then, that became associated with being on the left versus being on the right. And I had people like write me angry letters. I had people leave the church because I was asking them to wear masks when we did gather back together. And I did that because I thought that was the right thing. I trusted the science. I was trying to be careful and protect my people. But then it was political, and people said, you've sided with the opposition and left. And, stuff like that happens pretty regularly when you're just preaching and people read between the lines and they think, oh, that person's, they're against Donald Trump, and so I'm leaving, even though you never said that, but you may have preached something that Jesus said that went against what the president had said, and they thought you were picking sides, and so they thought they had to leave because of their tribe. And that happens enough. It makes you pretty gun shy about doing anything from the pulpit.
Right. It's probably my own bias as the pastor of faith formation, but I do think there's plenty of spaces outside of Sunday morning in the sanctuary where you can have these discussions. I think that's the beauty of the church, is that there are always usually adult education opportunities. There's times for the youth to gather and talk about these kind of things, but you have to be willing to talk about hard issues and not just Bible studies. Although a Bible study can get political, so I don't want to say that. But that there's opportunities for you and your Christian brothers and sisters to get together and have conversations outside of a worship hour. So.
Yeah, and I think part of what we do from the pulpit is our job is to nurture people in faith, and part of that nurturing is nurturing them in commitment to one another, even when they disagree, right? And if you can foster that, then that sets the groundwork for conversations.
Well, isn't that what
outside of
Jesus says? Love your neighbors. You've heard love your neighbors. I'm telling you to love your enemies.
Right.
And in this political climate, the other person sure feels like an enemy,
Right,
even
right.
though they're not. They
If
are
you
not
voted
your enemy.
Republican, you're taught to despise or think that the Democrats are evil and vice versa. Right. And people do. The things they say about the other party, and you'd want to just grab them and say, you're talking about your brother or sister in Christ right now? That's not okay. And I think that's why people say when anything even smells of politics, they just don't want anything to do with it because it's so polarized and so divisive in society that they come to church and they want relief from that. They want sanctuary from that.
Right. I think it's interesting that we threw out Christian values because when I think of Christian values, I think of forgiveness. I think of loving your enemies. I think of these kind of more personal ways that you interact in your community and in your world. And so when you hear politics immediately being brought into Christian values, I'm thinking I need to love the person that I disagree with. I need to love the person I don't understand. I don't understand immigrants very much, so I need to go out and meet an immigrant. I don't understand someone who's in a different socioeconomic level than I need to go talk to them, right? Jesus went out of his own comfort zone millions of times, and so I'm called to do that. That's my Christian value. And to forgive. If I'm hurt, if someone says something awful and atrocious to me, I'm to forgive them. And I'm to forgive if the ballot doesn't go the way that I like, okay, I'm still an American. I'm still in this system. This is still my country. I just fight the next day for the next election or for the next wave of whatever policy might be coming through. And so you never kind of give up. These are the Christian values that I uphold. And so it's funny that we keep talking about Christian values because I do see them as political, but they don't come with political policies. They come with how to engage in politics.
Right. And that's what I was thinking a minute ago while the conversation was happening, that the value of loving each other through disagreement has got to be higher than staking a claim to I am for or against this topic, this agenda, this issue.
Some people would say that the part of the problem with the church right now is that it's irrelevant. It doesn't push for or advocate for good in the world. It's silent on the things that matter the most, right? And so some people say, why would I, if the church isn't going to stand up for these things, for the things that I think are Christian values in the public square, then why should I go to church? It's irrelevant to the world. It's irrelevant to my life. And I've heard that, especially from younger Christians, saying, we need to lean in on these things. We need to be louder on these things because, if you're worried about the world falling apart and you go to church and they're silent on it, then you feel like the people that you thought would help aren't helping. They're not, the people you thought followed Jesus in the world don't seem to be. And then, us as leaders of the church, we're kind of stuck should we be doing more than we are?
Right. So I was recently ordained in March of 25. And so one of the things that I had to commit to is that I was a public leader of faith and to represent my church in the public square. And I think each pastor has to figure out what that means. But I think because I'm ordained in March of 2025 in the midst of this political world that we live in, when I said yes, that's what I was thinking of, is that I do need to be a voice in the midst of this to preach what I have discerned and prayed about and read my scriptures through of what I think should be politically voiced as an ethic for our country.
And it's hard to know, when do you do that as individual Pastor Michaela, right, and when do you do it as representative of First Lutheran Church or the ELCA? I think that's do you go to a protest? Do you wear your collar at a protest?
Right.
Are you a representative of something bigger than yourself, or are you just participating in the public sphere as a citizen of the United States?
Right. Well, it's funny when the gun rallies came out about school shootings. I remember going to one of the first ones that happened after one of the big school shootings for probably at least 10 years ago now. Goodness, we've been doing these rallies for a while. People were shocked to see people in their collars. I, at that time, was not ordained, so I wasn't in my collar, but I was there and I stood beside my fellow pastor at the time and with all of my youth group, and we stood there and we spoke against school shootings and the desire for not getting rid of guns, but just more safe practices around guns. And people were shocked to see a pastor there. And I think that shock can sometimes have a good effect, right? I didn't think that a pastor would come to a school shooting rally.
And so if you're a pastor and you want to
rally.
make a statement, you wear your
Right.
collar to these things.
Right.
But then if you're a member of that pastor's church and you disagree,
Right.
you're like, are they misusing their power and their
Absolutely.
authority because they're saying they represent something more than themselves when it's really just their opinion and not mine, not a shared opinion?
Right.
Like, I think it's really hard to know how to speak as an organization. Because really, if we wanted to speak as an organization, like at First Lutheran, we would say, we would bring the topic to council, and council would debate it and discuss it and say, okay, this is our statement that we're putting out. And then it would go to the whole congregation. The whole congregation would discuss it and debate it and vote on it and say, okay, this is our position. And that's when we would then proclaim it if we wanted to speak as a congregation. But I see a lot of times pastors just going rogue and saying, this is what I believe, and I'm just going to say it because, and then a lot of members of their congregation are left in the lurch going, I don't believe that, and I'm not sure that's right, and I didn't get a say in that.
Right.
And you're claiming to represent me.
Well, I'm thinking, so I am the boomer in the room, which I've said before, but I'm a young boomer, comparatively speaking.
Yes, you are.
And so I was a child during the civil rights movement, and so I didn't see a lot of that, didn't have an opportunity to participate in any of that. But I remember looking at pictures not too long after and seeing somebody in one of the marches with a collar. And that made an impression.
Yeah.
That was an important thing to do. But I don't know. I'm making an assumption that was a Catholic priest. And was the Catholic Church behind that? Did that priest go rogue?
And take the church with them, in their uniform.
Well, the civil rights movement is a very intriguing topic because Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter to a Birmingham jail calls out white pastors for not doing enough in the civil rights movement, for giving it lip service, but not actually doing anything with their hands, not going to rallies, not doing anything. They just would say, we support you in the civil rights movement. And so I think that's an intriguing one to bring up because I think that gives a little bit of context to this, true, of like we worry about how much to bring it into our church because we don't want to divide an already divided church. And there's certain things that we probably should be doing more on, but then what more do you do?
Well, it takes risk, I think, and I get pressure from both sides. I get pressure.
Absolutely.
Say more, Pastor. How come you're not saying more? Like, world's falling apart. This is a 100-year storm. Like, this is, if you're going to speak up, this is the time. Like, democracy's going away, and like these real fears. And then, and there's even like this subtle threat. Like, if you don't start speaking up, I'm going to go find a church that does. But then I get pressure from the other side saying, can't believe you mentioned that, like you're reading the Beatitudes or something and then thinking that it's anti-government or whatever, or just warning me, don't go there, or thanking me. That's another way to apply pressure to a pastor is thank you so much for making this a safe place and not talking politics. We're so glad that we can come here and not hear any of that. And so as a pastor, you're trying to decide, like, what does it mean to be prophetic and speak the truth and be courageous? And what's my own stuff that, like, I just want to vent. I think I watch the news and I'm upset and angry and I want to say something and I've got a pulpit. So I can go up there and I can use that pulpit and I can vent and it can be catharsis for me and I can kind of just say, this is all terrible. And I can spew my opinion, like I do on the internet or whatever. And that, like, I just think it's really hard to know what the right thing to do is. Like, I try to focus on big picture things. Like when I'm thinking about immigration, I'm thinking, everyone's made in the image of God. And, how do we love our neighbor? And then scripture that says to treat the alien, the foreigner well and to welcome them, and then same with like racism, that we're made in the image of the God, that we're all equal, to try to get at those issues from like the value perspective and the big picture and hope. And maybe it's, another person has told me that you can't expect people to make the connections, to connect the dots. Like you'll state a Christian value and in your mind it's pretty clear that if you believe in this, then you would oppose this policy that's happening in the world. And I've been told that just doesn't, people don't make those connections. Like you have to actually handhold them and say, no, I'm saying image of God. That means that we can't, put immigrants in alligator Alcatraz or whatever, like those two things in my mind connect in how we treat people. But if you say that, then you've picked a side and you've polarized the congregation, and now you're in the middle of a fight. So I guess I'm just pity party on being a pastor, but it's hard. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is, because you also don't want to get on the other side of anything like the civil rights movement and say, oh, I was one of those pastors who never spoke up, who never did anything to help, African Americans, or moving the needle toward equality, or moving my congregation toward that acceptance. Like you don't want to be wrong, and you certainly don't want to get to heaven and get up to Jesus and just hang your head in shame, which I think we're going to all do anyway, and say, I'm sorry, I was a coward in that moment, right? Like, I don't know, those are the pressures that I feel as a pastor, to kind of wade through this, try to figure out when do you speak up and when do you do it in the adult forum instead of the pulpit.
Right.
What protest do you show up to and which one do you avoid?
Well, I think that's a really important reason to have the conversations, even like we're having now. It's an uncomfortable topic, at least for me. I don't think I'm the only one in the room that feels it's a little uncomfortable. But, looking back historically, it's easy for us to pass judgment on people who didn't speak up in the civil rights movement, or it's easy for us to pass judgment on the average German as Hitler was ascending to power. It's easy for us to do that. But when you're in the midst of it, I think it's a lot harder to discern. Absolutely. Some people are really clear, this is wrong, and it's always been wrong, and it will always be wrong. I don't know. The phrase, the wrong side of history, gets thrown out quite a bit. And, it's easy to look back and make those clear distinctions.
Like, would I have stood up to the Nazis, or would I have just kind of be quiet about it so I didn't get hurt,
Kind of thing. Or would it have been so obvious as it was first beginning, if you were Joe Average, I don't know what the German equivalent of Joe is, Fritz Average, would it, or for me, Greta Average, would I have been able to tell what was happening, or would I have just been so concerned with my family and trying to keep food on the table and that kind of thing? I just don't know. I don't want to pass judgment. That's all. Yeah,
for me, it's been, I want to be able to preach the gospel to as many people as possible. And so I don't want to say things that ostracize people or push people out or create an echo chamber where now I'm preaching to the gospel to everybody who agrees with me. Yeah. And all the people who I really think needed to change their mind have exited the building, right. And they're not hearing the message anymore because the politics of the pastor was so offensive to them, so they just left. And so it's trying to hold a congregation together and challenge, and this is what I have done, is challenge people to try to find someone who disagrees with them and listen to the other side and try to understand, so that they'll at least stay together in relationship.
And you've preached that from the pulpit, and I've had people come to me and been like, Pastor Travis told me I should go talk to my neighbor. So I did. Right. So, right. And that neighbor is the person that has the big flag out in front of their house. And so I think my fear is the echo chamber, because I think there's no change that's going to happen from an echo chamber. And that's why I always worry about social media, because the algorithm is set up to give you constantly what you already watch and you already want to watch. And so there's sometimes where I'm like, I see something that the algorithm just shockingly gave to me, and I'll listen to it from the other side, and I'll be like, wow, okay, that's their take on this. Okay. And it could be anything. It could be not political. It's just someone from a completely different perspective that I never would have considered. And I choose to actively watch it because I want to hear a different perspective from my own. And then the algorithm gives you a few more things. And so I think echo chambers are the hardest, because then you really get knocked off course. Mm-hmm. If something comes through an election that you are just shocked by. I remember sitting in California when Donald Trump won his first presidency, and I was in Bay Area, California, where everyone was sure that Hillary was going to take it, was sure. And I was like, wow, we have really created an echo chamber. And that day after the election, people were crying in the Bay Area. And I was not shocked. I had done my due diligence to like try to get to know a cross section of my community. And so I was not shocked. But the echo chamber that had been created in that community and in that space of the Bay Area, they were just totally knocked for that decision and were very shocked. And I think that hurts more if you don't know your neighbor enough to see that there's different perspectives than what you have, and to be welcoming of those, listening to those, because the echo chambers can be super dangerous.
And I think we have to do it all. Like on one hand, we have to speak what we think is the gospel truth, speak in a way that, like, if there's sin in the world, if there's injustice, like, our job is to speak against that. Our job is also to encourage people to listen to either perspectives and hold together and to minister to the whole. Because I remember after the first Trump presidency, there were especially women in tears and really scared and worried because of some of the things that he had said. And so I come to church and I know that they're really sad. And I also know that there's other people that are like, finally, we've got the man who will, lead us in the right direction in the White House and can go, can fight for us and our policies and the things we care about. And so now you're trying to preach to both groups of people at the same time. So I think that's like, when it comes to individual politicians, it's maybe easier to like, don't endorse, recognize that there's two different teams, or supporters or fans of different teams in the same congregation. But I think I need to tell myself to be careful not to think that the answer is just be silent on every topic. Like, there are some things that you need to speak out, especially for the vulnerable. And like, for me, it's been kind of racism and immigration are the things I've preached about. Like, and I haven't commented on specific policies, but I've laid out kind of the Christian vision for welcoming and equality and image of God and things like that, which in my mind translates to policies, even if I don't draw the line for everybody. But
So let your kingdom come, let your will be done. That's been abused, I think, in churches, to put forth a political agenda, because they conflate the kingdom of God with what that church's agenda is or what that theological system is. So thinking kingdom-wise, and bringing that into politics.
Like, are we trying to make down here like up there, as they say, like, are we trying to create God's kingdom here by pushing for certain policies to make America more Christian?
Well, again, define Christian,
Right.
but that was one of the things studying in church history, that all of medieval Europe, all of those different rulers thought they were establishing God's kingdom on earth. And so by doing that, we will kill everyone who disagrees with us.
Right. Well, we used to have that, right? We used to have, like, church and state did not used to be separate. Like, it used to be the same. Like, the head of the state was the head of the church. And we decided we didn't like that. And it partly is because people disagree about what Christianity is and what parts of Christianity to emphasize. And so separating Christianity from the state, or church and state, allows us to give all voices a say, rather than, and maybe it's just a humility on, like, to maintain that separation means that as a church, we're humble enough to say, I have an opinion about what the Christian ethic is, but I am not going to pretend that I should be in power and be able to enforce that on everybody. That I should listen to those who are different than me. Like, I'll give an example in same-sex marriage, that, like, my opinion has been that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's the only thing that is marriage. When I was in North Carolina, there was that was the time when all the laws were coming up to expand the Constitution to make it, for same-sex marriage to be legal. And then, so when I go to the poll booth, what do you call those things? The ballot box, whatever.
Ballot box, yeah.
To vote, like, I'm torn between those things. Like, I have my personal conviction and what I think the faith is, but then I also, like, I know gay couples, and, like, I'm not mad at them. I don't want to, like, hurt them in any way. And so I voted for the amendment that would allow for the legality of same-sex marriage, right? And so there was, like, that tension even in me, whereas there was no separation of church and state, then it might just be, not listening to the other voice or not allowing space for people that are different. And that seems dangerous. And so I think keep maintaining that separation protects us in case we're wrong.
Right. Yeah. So I have two comments on church and state. One is research shows that when you have church and state enmeshed, they're more likely to fall out of faith. So
it's not like Europe is, you got all these state churches and are full of faithful Christians.
Exactly. Europe is the research base of, wow, there's religion declining, Christianity declining on a massive scale. And everyone's sure that America would fall in line, would do the same thing because it's the West. It's just, that's how the West is going to work. But because there is this church and state enmeshment, it becomes that church becomes just a government thing. Like, this is where I get married. This is where I get my funeral, but I don't need to go any other time. Meanwhile, we have in America a separation of church and state, and so we actually keep it apart, and it's what allowed America to keep thriving. And so we are not seeing the same decline, at least not on a rapid scale, at least not on the kind of like church is just an institution that we use for certain jobs and roles in our lives, and otherwise we don't need it. Like, Christianity is something that we can personally have because we have a church and state that's separated. And then the second is that Stephen Colbert had a clip that went wide just a couple weeks ago about his own faith in the Catholic Church and why he likes that there's a church and state separation. Because he said, what if your party is the church party, is Jesus ordained, and then you don't win? Wow, your Jesus doesn't look so strong anymore, does it? Because Jesus isn't tied to these human authorities and principalities. He says, my church is going to outlive America. And that was shocking. That's why it went viral, because we know this. We know every kingdom is going to fall. Every human kingdom is going to fall, right? Rome, the big Rome fell.
Yeah.
These huge kingdoms will always eventually pass. But Jesus is not ever going to be that way. And so when you enmesh them, it makes Jesus more fragile, and Jesus is never fragile.
Right. It's to lessen Jesus. I remember I was doing a funeral, and it was for a soldier or maybe a sailor. And they, so the person had the color guard there. They were draping the casket in a flag and going to do the whole ceremony that they do. And I've been at a lot of those. And I've always felt like there's this competing identity, because we have something that we cover the casket with too. We have a pall that represents baptism and the identity in Christ. And so which one goes on? Is it the flag or is it the pall, the Christian pall? And it's the same debate with do you have a flag in the sanctuary or not? And why not? So I was about to do this funeral, and these two sailors that was their job, was to do the folding of the flag and all that. And they just took the opportunity to ask me that, how come we have to stay out here and you don't want us in the sanctuary? And I said, well, when you take a flag, and you take new ground as a soldier or a sailor or whatever, what do? You plant the flag, right, to claim that territory. And they're like, yeah, that's what we do. That's what the flag is. It's claiming this land or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, in the church, that's not your land. Jesus claims that. And the flag is the nation that it's in, that's secondary to the claim that Jesus has and that God has on this land. And to keep that separate is really important. And they totally understood. They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Why would you ever put a flag in a sanctuary? That's God's space, not America's space. And I was just really appreciated there. As soon as you kind of walk through the logic of it, that, our American identity is really important and valuable, and people have died for it. Mm-hmm. But it's not as important as our Christian identity, and not as important as being made in the image of God identity. That thing that's supersedes everything else. Mm-hmm. And we need rituals and practices, and what we do with flags and all that needs to mirror that and speak to that truth, so that people don't get confused. Because that's what happens with the Christian nationalism and all that, is people start conflating their Christian identity and their nationality, and they think they're one and the same, and that's to bring Christianity down, and it makes it this thing of power when it's something much more important than that. Mm-hmm. What do you guys think? American flags in the sanctuary?
Oh, I just say amen to what you just said. So,
yeah. Well, it's funny. I think it was like just church ethics, like a little sub thing that I had to do in seminary where they gave us all sorts of different scenarios of what would you do if you're the pastor. And it was funny. One of them was you have a congregant. They give a lot of money to the church and they want to bring in an American flag to sit right next to, like right on the altar, right next to the pulpit, right? It's up front. And it was like, discuss. And it was funny because a lot of people were trying to like make it work. Well, what if we had the flag, but it's in the back of the church? Like, because no one really wanted to say no to the big church member with the big pockets. Right. So it was funny to like be in that conversation because I would just say, no, we've never had a flag there. We won't have a flag there. I think it's harder to remove a flag that has already been planted there. But if someone's coming in and saying, I want to put a flag, I think that's an easy no to say, I don't think it's there. I think when you come into a church that already has a flag there, it would depend on how much the flag actually made an appearance or was looked at all. And if,
like, are you processing the flag in every Sunday? You know.
Well, even if like because we have these 3-day holidays that happen throughout the year that celebrate, we have Labor Day, we have Memorial Day, we have Veterans Day. And so sometimes we do these kind of patriotic hymns, which are totally in line with where we do have Christianity coming into American culture. If we were to turn to the flag and sing those songs, like if that was part of the culture, then I'd be like, we need to get rid of this flag.
Right, because then it's idolatry.
Right, we're not singing to a flag. We're singing to God about that we are happy that God has blessed this nation and has been a part of the freedom that it represents and the independence that it represents. But we're singing to God. So I think it would depend on how that church cared about that flag, or if it really is, it looks like any other banner that's in the church.
I think the thing is the flag and patriotism in America, like that has a deep hold on people's identity, and it is part of their identity. It's part of who they are, especially if they were in the armed services. Like they fought and died for those things and saw their friends die for these things. Absolutely. And so they're really sensitive to any insult, anything that seems to diminish it, or because it's not just the flag or the country, it's the person that put their life on the line for those things. Absolutely. And you don't want to ever insult that. And I understand that. Like you would get pretty offended and stand up and fight, and to, if that's what that flag represented, and someone's trying to take it out, and you think it's, diminishing your friend's sacrifice on the battlefield, you're going to be really upset with that. So I think just pastoral care-wise, you got to be gentle in how you introduce that, but you're trying to teach, like, we have a higher authority than this country. This country is really important, but not supremely important. Right. And that God is the one who is, there was a time before this country existed. There will be a time after this country exists. And God will still be on the throne, that God's still in charge. And we want to recognize and honor that. Like for me, I've always just said our flag is the cross. And the cross doesn't make a distinction between what country you're a citizen of.
Right. Well, and in our prayers of the people, we always do pray for our world leaders. And so we do want God to bless America and American leaders. We also want God to bless any other leaders that are out there making big decisions for humanity, because all are made in the image of God. And so we do want God to be a part of our country.
Like we're for America, right? Like Christians should be for America if you're in America. You should be for Mexico if you're a Christian in Mexico. Right. And, and for Ireland if you're a Christian in Ireland. Like, and probably as a Christian, you should be for all the countries. Like you want all of them to benefit. You don't pick one over the other because you believe in a God who's God of all. And that's kind of the message of the cross, is trying to show the equality of everybody, and that forgiveness is for everybody and salvation is for everybody. And we should care for each other, and we're all united to each other. And nation states try to separate all that out. But still, we're for our country, and our faith propels us to love our country and serve it and make it better.
I think patriotism is fine, any country, all the way across the board. But when you do associate your particular country with exceptionalism of some kind, that somehow God loves your country better than any other country.
We're the favorite son of God?
Yeah, right, the favorite.
Or daughter.
Right. But I always think, well, what does that say to all the other countries?
Yeah. it's Joseph all over again.
Right.
The other 11 brothers who are still the tribes of Israel, very upset.
Right.
Right. With that, but that's, in Jesus with the equality.
Yeah.
There is no slave nor free nor Jew nor Greek or any of those other separations. That if you're planting a flag, literally saying my country is the best, in God's eyes, and hold that belief, what does that say to all the rest of them? I'm not a fan. Not a fan.
It's not the message of Christianity.
Right.
The message of Christianity is to cross borders and boundaries and erase them and erase the lines that divide us and bring people together, serve all people, not just your favorite people, and even I think of like there's country and then there's also family, which even more sacrosanct, right? That you can't, like, my family's the most important thing. And like, I think there was some politician that was kind of delineating all the, like, who do you love first? You love your family, you love God, you love your country. And I think God does away with all that and says, no, you love everybody. And I think of Jesus, his family was outside and he was teaching people, and they said, your family's outside. And he says, who's my brother? Who's my sister? Who's my mother? It's the one who does the work of God. And that was crazy controversial in those days, to say that your family wasn't as important as as other people who you were not related to. And that's what we say as Christians, is like, non-Americans are just as important to us as Americans. And that's, especially these days, that's pretty controversial. But that's the message of Christianity, that tries to go do away with all those dividing lines that we erect.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was the big news of the New Testament, and especially the Acts of the Apostles, is opening it wide. It wasn't just Israel as the chosen person, as the chosen people anymore. It's everyone's welcome. It was something that Peter had to have a vision from God to understand, right? Paul's out there going, Gentiles, welcome in. People from everywhere, welcome in. And Peter's like, whoa, Paul. And then had to have a vision to, like, come to that himself. What God deems is clean or unclean is what God's the judge.
God decides, yeah.
Right? And so forever it was Israel as the chosen people. And at that time it's kind of similar to our statehood now, and the countries now, right? Israel was its own place. And so even though it was in occupied territory, you would have Romans next door to you, and they're out and
Right.
we're in. And you're the outsider in our land, even though you've come to occupy it. And so, and for then Paul to go all over the Mediterranean and then head to Rome, like directly to Rome, and say, and proclaim Jesus and say, this is for you too. That was huge. That was huge. But that's what Christ wanted. Christ wanted us to go to the edge of the world.
When I think of like I want America to be a Christian nation, and I have my idea of what that means. And so maybe we can close on this question: is what does it mean to you for America to be a Christian nation? And for me, it means that the first shall be last, and you shall be a servant of all. Like, America is the most powerful, wealthiest nation in the world. And so for me, for it to be a Christian nation means it should be a servant of the world, that America should use its resources and its power and its policies to bless every nation on the world, to bless our own people, especially the poor and the neglected, but not just in our nation, but in every nation. And I think if we do that, that actually makes the whole world a better place, if we are actually following Christ as a nation, which means becoming a servant to others, rather than flexing our muscles and like showing that we're stronger than everybody and threatening them. If they don't do what we want, we'll nuke them or whatever. Like, that's not Christian. Like, Christian, in my mind, is a posture of servanthood and giving yourself away and sacrificing for the sake of the whole. As your interpretation of Christianity, what would make America a more Christian nation?
One not asserting power over others. So very, very similar, but just maybe looked at from the different side. The surrendering of power for the benefit of the other, which is what you're saying. It's just addressing power specifically.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that we have a lot of resources that other countries don't. And I think there's a piece of humility, because we do think that we're somehow the best. And there's actually countries that are doing, policies that I would love to see in America. I'm talking healthcare, guys. And And so I think there's also some humility to say, okay, we can collaborate, we can work together, we can learn from other people. Like we are wealthy, we do have all of this power. How can we use it? How can we lift up voices that are speaking to equitable policies and procedures in their country and valuing their citizens? Because I think as rulers in a Christian nation, they should be caring for their citizens as best they can. And I think with America being so big, it's a lot harder than the tiny little countries that I'm imagining because they have much fewer citizens to try to care for. So it's a hard ask, but I think it's a worthy ask.
Yeah, I think that, a humble nation that can learn from anybody, but that seeks to serve others as Christ has taught us. I think that's what it, in my mind, means to be a Christian nation. And I think the church ought to move us toward that, and as individual Christians and carefully as collective Christians, as congregations, as we seek to figure out the wisest way to speak on behalf of the vision Jesus has for the world to our civic society. That's it for this episode. I hope you guys will come back and join us next time.